Berlin has become a stage for a very modern genre of diplomacy, where the fate of the war is being nudged toward peace by people whose main expertise is not state policy, but their closeness to the president. One special envoy who consistently speaks as if he's giving a presentation to investors. The second is the president's son-in-law, whose presence is meant to convince everyone that this is serious. Yes, it is serious. So serious, in fact, that instead of institutions, there are personal connections. Instead of responsibility, loyalty, instead of mechanisms, just words. And it is within this scheme that the magical phrase significant progress is born. Wonderful words. They contain no territories, no guarantees, no oversight, no sanctions, and no accountability for failure. But they work perfectly for a headline. Significant progress. Is that when, after 5 hours of talks, no one threw a chair? When there was no scandal? When you didn't have to explain to the voters why the brilliant deal didn't happen again? And here you want to ask, what kind of negotiation school is this, where the result is not a text, not a signature, not commitments, but simply the fact that the room didn't explode? Because that's no longer diplomacy, it's an imitation of a coronavirus process being sold as a success. Especially when the people in the frame are those who can promise anything they want, and then tomorrow say the context has changed. That's why the Berlin round is a test not only for Ukraine and Europe, it's a test for Washington as well. Does it really lead to peace? Or is it just about finding the right wording so that later someone can be blamed if Moscow says no? This is Nia Novik with you. I'll cover the main events that are currently shaping Ukraine, Europe, the US, and global politics as a whole. The meeting in Berlin between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, US Presidential Envoy Stephen Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and the US and Ukrainian delegations lasted more than 5 hours and ended with an agreement to continue the conversation on Monday. This was confirmed by the Ukrainian side, while from the American side came the phrase significant progress and a mention of a 20-point peace plan. Now, the main question I want you to ask yourself right away is, progress in what exactly? In the substance? In the parties' willingness to sign documents? In bringing positions closer together regarding territories? Or is it simply that the parties have just agreed to keep talking? Because that's often how diplomacy works, especially when diplomacy is driven by a political demand from the White House, deliver results. Not necessarily substantive, not necessarily fair, not necessarily realistic, but a result that can be sold to the voter as proof of effectiveness. And here we come to the essence of what is happening. The Berlin format looks like an attempt to coordinate the American, Ukrainian, and European positions before the Americans go to talk to Moscow, or at least present Moscow with what they call a coordinated plan. But there is a problem that for some reason people keep trying to push aside. And will Russia agree to this? Or are we once again seeing a situation where the democratic world coordinates the framework of a compromise among themselves, only to find out that the Kremlin accepts nothing except occupation? And then the whole plan turns into a mechanism for finding someone to blame. And here, attention, this is where Ukraine's task number 1 arises. In this process, Ukraine must do everything so that it cannot be accused of being unconstructive. Not because this is a game of good manners, but because in American domestic politics, it's very convenient to say, we offered and they refused. And after that, to shift the responsibility for aid, weapons, sanctions, intelligence, all the things that actually keep Ukraine going in this war off themselves. That's why when Witkoff says significant progress, it could also mean something very simple. Ukraine won't be so easily blamed for disrupting the negotiations. The second important detail is the actual composition of the American delegation. The Europeans wanted to see the US Secretary of State at such a round, a formal figure, an institution, someone who thinks in terms of state policy and responsibility before Congress. But instead, what we see is a special envoy and the president's son-in-law, people who can speak on behalf of the head of the White House, but not necessarily on behalf of the American state as an institution. And that's a fundamental difference, because an institution weighs its words, promises, and mechanisms. But people who work in the president's personal office often bring the logic of real estate deals into diplomacy. We'll make a deal, sign it, and leave. But what exactly did we sign? And whose legal obligation is it? How will it be ratified? Then what happens if the next day one of the parties decides that everything has changed? That's exactly why we so often see beautiful words in American communication, but so rarely see mechanisms. Now, about the most high-profile topic of these negotiations, NATO. According to Reuters, Zelensky stated that he is ready to abandon Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO in exchange for legally binding security guarantees from the US and partners in Europe and beyond. This is truly a colossal shift in position, since the course toward NATO is enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And here there are several levels of problems at once. The first is political. Yes, this coincides with one of Moscow's key demands. But coinciding with the aggressor's demand does not mean resolving the war, because Moscow will never stop at just one point. It takes a concession as a sign of weakness and asks for the next one. The second is legal. Even if someone in Ukraine wanted to make such a turn in the most formal way, it would mean complicated procedures, constitutional changes, and political legitimization. And all this in a country at war, under attack, in a state of existential crisis. The third and main issue, security guarantees. Zelensky talks about guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5 and emphasizes that they must be legally binding. Now ask yourself, are the United States ready to give Ukraine Article 5 without NATO? Or are we once again hearing about supplying weapons and imposing sanctions in the event of renewed aggression? Because supplying weapons and sanctions are not security guarantees, they are guarantees of support. They are important, they are necessary. Without them, survival is impossible. But they don't stop a missile in the sky or block an order to advance. Not to mention that Ukraine has bitter experience with guarantees. And the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius says directly, guarantees alone, especially without significant US involvement, may not be enough. We need to look at territorial issues, Russia's obligations, and the conditions for implementation. Now, about the territories, because without territories, this plan does not exist. According to Zelensky's words, and what is leaking into the information space, the Americans have proposed options that include the idea of a kind of free economic zone or demilitarized territory in part of Donetsk region, where Ukrainian troops are still currently stationed. And here is a simple question that destroys the elegance of any document. Who controls this zone? If Ukrainian troops withdraw and Russian troops do not enter, who maintains order? The police? Which police? International forces? Which ones exactly? With what mandate? With what ability to return fire? Or are we once again falling into the trap where Russia does not formally enter with its army, but comes in with the National Guard, special services, and administrations that overnight turn the territory into an occupied one? Because occupation is not just about tanks. Occupation is about control over people, information, fear, and the law. And that is why the idea of a demilitarized zone without a strict control mechanism is not a compromise. It's a technology of creeping occupation. A separate topic is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It always comes up whenever someone wants to invent joint control as a kind of magic formula. But why should we believe that Russia will voluntarily give up such a tool of blackmail? Who will be the second party to any kind of control? And what will happen if tomorrow Moscow decides that control is its right by force? Diplomacy without an enforcement mechanism is a genre of literature, not of politics. And one more important thing that cannot be overlooked is Trump's motivation. The haste is obvious. Both the media and analysts are writing about this. The US wants a deal, preferably by the end of the year. Why? There's the Nobel Prize theory, and it always looks good in headlines. But there is a much more prosaic logic, China. The Trump administration is thinking strategically in terms of confrontation with Beijing and is trying to clear the Ukrainian track in order to focus on the Chinese one. And here arises the temptation to make a deal with Russia so that it is at least not an active ally of China. There is only one problem. Russia does not play the role of a neutral arbiter. Russia is a participant in the war who wants to be rewarded for its aggression. And if it is rewarded, it concludes that aggression works. And then the war does not end. It simply changes the pause between strikes. Therefore, the summary of today's day in Berlin, or more precisely the Berlin hours, looks like this. First, negotiations are ongoing, and this means that no one wants to take on the role of the one who broke them off. Second, there is a plan consisting of 20 points. And this means that the Americans have structured the proposal after previous rounds. Third, Ukraine has taken an extremely painful symbolic step, a willingness to discuss renouncing NATO membership, but ties this to legally binding guarantees. Fourth, The most dangerous issues, territories, control, enforcement mechanisms, still do not have public answers. And this means that either there are no answers or they do not want to reveal them until the moment comes to sell the agreements to the public. And now the most important thing, Ukraine's goal is not to please the American negotiators. Ukraine's goal is to survive, to preserve the state, to preserve the army, to preserve the ability to resist, and to ensure that any pause in the war does not become a corridor for a new attack. Because if a pause is just time for Russia to prepare its next offensive, then that's not peace, it's a postponed catastrophe. Of course, we are waiting for a more substantial comment from Zelensky after the Berlin round is over. His advisor stated directly that the president would speak after the negotiations conclude on Monday, and then it will become clearer where the lines of compromise actually lie and where the lines are that Ukraine cannot and should not cross. For now, remember one simple formula. When someone tells you there has been significant progress, always ask, progress in what exactly? Because in diplomacy, there are two types of progress. Progress toward peace and progress towards surrendering positions. And sometimes these things are disguised as one another. If you want these kinds of analyses to come out regularly, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and write in the comments what you consider to be red lines in this process. NATO, territories, US guarantees, international forces, and sanctions. Your comments, strangely enough, are also part of politics, because politicians read social signals. This was Ania Novak with you. Your reactions help us stay focused on what matters most. See you next time.